Welcome to Author Life Podcast, where myself and guest authors share their stories, offer tips and advice, and share our writing, publishing, and marketing knowledge. I'm your host, Delcherie Gladden. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Delcherie Gladden, and this week we're going to be talking about effective outlining. And I think when you start thinking about outlining a story, you really have to also think about storyline. And what is the purpose of a storyline, and how do you create a strong storyline for your project? And planning, in a lot of cases, is a big part of that. Even if you tend to be more of a pantser than a plotter, you're still doing some sort of planning and outlining, even if you're not really writing it down in a structured format. That's still a process that you're going through in your head. And so a lot of these tips you can still use even if you're not going to create a formal, structured outline. It can still help you kind of deconstruct your story and figure out where things might be lacking and where you need to, tighten things up. So let's start by talking about what is a story outline and what are the pieces and parts of that. And the main sections that we're going to go over in this episode are structure, plot, characters, scenes, events, and conflict. All of those come together and play a part in developing a storyline, and so they need to be considered when you're outlining as well. So outlines provide a skeleton or kind of a roadmap for the full story that you're working on. And like I said, even if you're a pantser, you're still going to be working through these in sections as you're writing, whether you write in order or out of order. So depending on your process, you might not go in this linear fashion, but that's what I'm going to use to talk about this, just to keep it cohesive and coherent for a podcast episode. So when you're creating this skeleton or map, the point of doing that is that it's going to help you visualize the big picture of the story. It's going to help you organize your story details and then keep the story on track. So you're not having, lulls or everything jam-packed into one section, and then you don't know how to fill other parts of the story. And it's also going to help you create nice, full character arcs, plan scenes, and structure them in a way that keeps the story moving. And I think that last part especially is something that newer writers or writers kind of venturing out into something new, new genre or new style, that can be a really hard aspect, because you can get into it and start writing and then maybe just hit a block or run out of ideas, and you're kind of left with this empty section or really slow moving section. And going back and outlining, even if you're kind of mid-process, can really help you identify those lulls and then figure out the best way to fill them and to keep the story moving along. So questions that your outline should answer. These are really important to think about as you're working through the process of outlining, and it can help you really identify where things are lacking and where things need to be either tightened up or filled in. So what is the main contract made with the reader at the beginning of the story? What are you promising your reader? If it's a romance, that promise may be a happily ever after. If it's an adventure, it may be that there's going to be a journey fulfilled. If it's a mystery, the mystery is most likely going to be solved. So think about that as you're starting your outline. What are you promising the reader? Because by the time you get to the end, you need to fulfill that promise to the reader. Next question is, are all of those promises resolved by the end? And that is something that can be really helpful if you actually write down these promises that you're making to the reader. And then when you get to the end, before you start editing, look at those promises and figure out whether or not you answered them. Because if you didn't, that's going to be a big part of your revisions as you go back through and edit. Next thing to consider is what pressures are working on the characters. There should always be aspects of the storyline that are working to prevent the character from reaching their goal. And there may be multiple, there may be one major and several smaller ones, but keep in mind what those are and keep track of them throughout the story. Also, does the pressure grow more intense as the story progresses? A lot of writers have seen kind of that roller coaster look of the story arc and how it, goes up and maybe ebbs a little, goes up again, and keeps going until you reach the climax. If you have sections of your roller coaster that are flat, that's where we need to see some improvement in those pressures and conflicts. And the next thing to consider is what is at stake for the main characters. They're working toward a particular goal because it holds value for them. And if you aren't sure what that value is or what's at risk if they don't reach that goal, then usually that goal needs to be defined a little bit more and kind of taking a deeper dive into why that character wants that. When you have a clearer picture of that, you're going to be able to develop that conflict a little bit better. Are the stakes high enough that failure inspires stress or anxiety for the reader? Does your reader care about what your character wants? If they don't care, they're probably not going to continue reading the story. So it not only has to be important to your reader, it has to be important to your character and your reader. And then, does the ending make logical sense? And does it fit with the character and the rest of the story? If you have an ending in mind when you start writing and then things change over time, but you still really want to make that ending work, it's usually not going to work. So you really need to look at your ending objectively and make sure that it still makes sense after developing everything between the beginning and the end. Do the character's actions and thoughts logically lead up to that ending? And if not, then you need to go back and rework a few things or make some revisions. So when you're looking at these questions, when you find one that you can't answer with your outline on your first approach or your first run through, then those are areas where you need to dig deeper or step back and consider why that question is so hard to answer. What's missing? What's not fitting together? And once you delve into that a little bit more and find those answers, you're going to have a much stronger and clearer storyline. Does the storyline need to be altered, or is there an issue with the character that prevents the easier answer? So that is something a lot of the time it's not just the storyline, it's something with the characters because they do develop independently in some ways. You're learning this character, you're turning them into, this real person in your mind. And sometimes that develops into a different character than you initially imagined. And so as that character develops, sometimes you do have to make some changes to your storyline to make them fit together in a way that makes sense. Unanswered questions really are those prompts that you need to be looking for additional development, and they can really provide good chances to explore new ideas within a story. And it can lead you to some really interesting changes and really deepen your story if you go down that path of finding those answers. So there are a few different types of outlining methods, and what method you choose to use really just depends on your preference and your style. But if you're new to outlining, I would encourage you to try a couple of different methods and see which one's going to work best for you, because you might be surprised. A lot of people just kind of start with a traditional style synopsis or chapter by chapter outline, and your creative process might work better with something, more like snowflake or bookend. So let's dive into what some of these outlining methods are, and that may help you determine which one you might want to try. So the synopsis outline is one that a lot of people are familiar with. It's typically a 1 to 2 page document that roughly sketches out the structure of the story, but still leaves room for flexibility. So it's not super specific, but it's going to hit most of the main plot points and highlights, maybe address some of the themes in the story. It's going to give you the bigger details without really deep diving into the minutia of the story. And so this can help you kind of figure out what major scenes you're going to need to write, what your character arcs are going to look like in an overall sense. And this method creates basically a loose framework that can be further developed while you are actually doing the writing. Now, the in-depth outline is similar, but it's going to go deeper into some of those details that really kind of skip over a bit in the synopsis outline. It's more comprehensive with chapter summaries that are going to break up individual scenes. For a lot of people, each chapter will contain one major scene in the outline, and there may be more to it once you actually start writing, but you want to know what the major event or action is going to be done in that scene and why that is important to the overall story. This type of outline is going to include detailed timelines, character details, your major plot points, and also some of the subplots, which is something that's typically not included too much in the synopsis outline. This type of scene level description is usually there on some level, just to kind of set the stage, but it's not going to go super specific into, what every single scene in the chapter is going to look like. Just kind of the highlights there. But what you will see are usually the full character and plot arcs in an in-depth outline, showing kind of where the major transition points are in both of those. And that really just helps you to make sure that you're including important scenes that need to be there in order to bring those arcs from beginning to conclusion. And in this type of outline, you're usually going to pay particular attention to the flow between the scenes and the pacing of the overall arcs. So when you do break your outline down into scenes, you can see a little bit better how each scene is going to connect with each other, and that helps you make sure that each scene is important to the story and it's not just kind of filler, basically. Now, with the snowflake method, this method is quite a bit different than the first two. Typically, how people approach the snowflake method is you'll start with a one-sentence summary of the story, mainly the story idea, the overall concept of the story. And then you're going to build that into a paragraph that tells a little bit more about the story. Then you're going to branch off from that and start creating some character descriptions and deeper aspects of the storyline and maybe some subplots. And it kind of spreads out from that main concept and then gets deeper and more detailed the further out from that starting point that you get. But even so, this structure still remains fairly loose. And as it branches off into different story aspects, you can explore ideas without completely committing to them being within the actual story, how it's going to turn out at the end. And this is a really nice approach for someone who needs to do a little bit more brainstorming and fleshing out of their story if they've got kind of an overall concept or a general idea of the characters, but they're not completely sure how they're going to fill in all of the in-between spaces. This can really help you figure out where those holes are and explore different options for getting your characters and your story from point A to point B. And the last method that I want to talk about is the bookend method. In this method, you start by plotting the beginning and the ending of the story. So kind of your starting point, your end point, and then the major part of the outlining process in the bookend method is filling in everything in between those 2 points. And that's going to include your characters, your story arc, and people will approach this in different ways, either kind of finding those traditional pinch points, major transition points with the character arc, or you can go in a more linear fashion once you have the beginning and end, then move from beginning through that storyline or character arc to the end. Kind of just depends on your process and what's going to work best for you, whether you do that in a linear way or kind of bounce around and find different points within the 2 bookends. What you do want to consider, though, is how the beginning and ending relate to each other and whether there is a meaningful link between the two that is believable and achievable. So I think this is a nice method for someone who maybe struggles to end their stories, comes up with great beginnings, loves starting a new project, but getting to that final chapter is really a struggle. This can be a good method for that because you have the ending. And even if that ending changes over the course of the actual writing process, that's fine, but you at least know a general direction of where you're going, and that can help keep from hitting those big stumbling blocks and giving up on a project too soon. And this method doesn't necessarily detail out every single small step between the beginning and the end, but it does give you a really nice sense of what major steps will be needed to get from point A to point B. And again, that can really just help, especially for someone who maybe tends to get stuck halfway through a project and not end up finishing it. Now, the first steps of starting the outlining process is really figuring out where to begin, because that can be the hardest part sometimes. A story idea may form in the middle of a story. When you first come up with it, it may be a scene somewhere in the middle or toward the end, and you're trying to build out from that. Or it maybe starts with a character idea, a what if, or, just kind of one of those random thoughts that you get as a person with a creative mind. And then you're trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I turn this into a short story, a novel, a poem, whatever it is that you're working on. Knowing where to start can be a really challenging aspect of completing a project. So you really want to focus with an outline on developing a clear beginning, a middle, and an ending of some sort. And this may be just general plot points, but it's important to have a concise path between the beginning and end. Like I said, that just really helps not get hung up on things halfway through a project. Storylines should not be lopsided, so either like heavily front-ended or heavily end-loaded. Working on an outline can help prevent that because it really puts into focus the overall arc of the character and the story. You want to consider using the 3-act structure to create that roller coaster-like pattern that I talked about of the rising and falling action. And make sure that the action or the revelations that come up during the story are not all crammed together in one section of the story. I think a typical example of this is kind of that cartoon villain of we get to the end and the good guy's tied up somewhere and the villain stands there explaining everything for 15 minutes. Not only is that very unrealistic, that is overwhelming for the reader. We want to sprinkle those bits of information throughout the story rather than dumping it on them all at once. So during the outline process, you really want to identify what those main plot lines are as well as your subplots, and then make sure that they all have a full arc. And every arc, whether story or character, should have a purpose. And you really want to determine what that purpose is and the steps required to fulfill the purpose. Dangling subplots leave questions and really frustrates readers. So you want to make sure that when you introduce a subplot, that it does have a purpose and is relevant to the story, and that it's complete and satisfying. Those subplots that you can't really flesh out and bring to a conclusion probably don't need to be there and can be removed. Maybe you had an idea of where it was going to go and it just never really fully realized. During your revision process, just get rid of that. You also want to focus on developing strong character arcs that have beginnings, middles, and ends. A character should change throughout a story. There are very rare exceptions to that. Most characters, we want to see those changes make sense and provide the reader with a sense of satisfaction by the end. If your character is basically the same on page 1 as on the final page, it's going to be dissatisfying and disappointing to the reader because they went on this journey with the character and they want to see the results of that journey. And if nothing really changed for them, the reader doesn't get that payoff. So that's an important part to focus on in your outlining as well. Underdeveloped characters leave readers feeling unfulfilled. So when you're evaluating your characters throughout the outlining process, you really want to ask whether or not a character has reached his or her full potential dictated by the events of the story. A character may have other things that are still unresolved, and the reader knows that they need to work on that if it was a real person continuing on past the last page. But anything relevant to the story needs to be fulfilled and satisfied by the time the story ends. So everything that happens to a character should have an effect. And you really need to consider the effects that accrue individually and in total for that character. And another part of developing a strong outline is really taking a look at that ending. Too many books kind of rush to the end, and I've felt it as a reader too, I just got to get to the last page. I'm so tired of working on this project. That's understandable, and sometimes you do just need to get it down on paper and just be done with it for a little bit. But going back and doing revisions, that's where you clean that up. If you can flesh some of that out and build a really strong ending during the outlining process, that can help make the writing process feel less daunting when you get to the end, because it can be really, really hard to end books well. So when thinking about your ending while you're outlining, you really want to make sure that it makes sense, that it makes logical sense with the story and the characters, but that it also wraps up the storyline. Readers who feel unsatisfied when a book ends are unlikely to read that author again. And as authors, that's what we really want. We want to create those dedicated fans that are going to keep reading our books. A strong ending really needs to fulfill all of the plots and subplots and provide interesting development for the characters. So those are important questions to ask as you're outlining your ending and wrapping things up. A flat, confusing, or illogical ending really deflates the entire story. It doesn't matter how good everything was up to that point. If the ending falls flat, the whole story is kind of ruined for the reader. And they will remember that, unfortunately. Endings that are wrapped up too quickly are most likely lacking something important. So if you do feel like you're rushing through that and this and that happened and boom, it's done. Yay. Stop, come back to that, take another look and see why it was so easy to wrap that up. Because most likely it needs a little further development if that's how the ending comes together. You really want to make sure, again, that the ending links back to the beginning and that the character's goals and desires are in some way, those goals and desires are met and have changed in a way that makes sense or that reaches a satisfying conclusion. The initial idea of what a character wants or what the story is going to entail absolutely can change as the story progresses, but those changes have to make sense. So if a character ends up reaching a slightly different goal than what they wanted in the beginning, just make sure that the reader can look back through the story and through the character decisions and actions and say, yeah, that makes sense. I know why that goal or desire changed. And again, just make sure that you have enough story to fill up your entire project, whether that's a short story, novella, full novel. Every word on the page, every scene, every instance with a character making a choice or thinking about something, it really needs to have a purpose. It needs to be relevant to the story. And if it's not, those are areas, that need to be trimmed during editing and revision. Don't force content into a story just for the sake of length. Anytime you just really focused on a particular length, it's putting an unnecessary box around your writing. And most oftentimes that's going to make a difficult process more difficult without reason. So, really when you're looking back through a full outline and evaluating it, cut what isn't relevant to the story. If it feels like an area is being stretched out longer than it needs to, just take a look at that and see where you can trim and make things a little bit more concise and meaningful. You don't have to focus on a certain length. If it ends up being shorter than you originally thought, that's fine. That's not So what are the steps for actually creating an outline? We're going to go through them now, and hopefully this helps if you're new to outlining or if you just need to try something new. So step one, we're going to start with the big picture by crafting the premise and the underlying idea of the story. Once you have that, 1 to 2 sentences to say, what is this story about? Then you can start expanding on your premise by asking, who is the main protagonist and how will they change from beginning to end? What is the situation and the central conflict of the story? What are the characters' objectives and their wants and needs? And what are the stakes? What is going to happen if the character fails or doesn't get what he or she wants? That is a very important question. And once you think through these questions, then take the time to actually write out a paragraph. Doesn't have to be long, but that summarizes the answers to all of those questions that we just covered. Step 2 would be determining the setting. Setting should relate to the story, either because it directly affects the story or the characters, or because it sets the right tone or mood. Really take the time to research the details and plan how the character is going to interact with the setting and how that setting is going to impact the story. What elements of the setting will play a part in the story, or what elements are going to help set the tone or the mood. Identify those early on. And then you want to determine some of your secondary scenes. Figure out which scenes are going to play important parts in certain scenes, but aren't going to be, consistent scenes throughout the story. And there should be a good reason for each placement. You don't have to go into a lot of depth on what that reason is, but choose your settings mindfully. So the next step, step 3, would be writing character profiles. And this is going to include backstory, current situation, and the end point that you want that character to reach. Determine what the character needs to learn by the end of the story, and then plot the steps the character will need to take to resolve whatever internal issues they're going to be dealing with. And then determine what external forces are going to be needed to push the character into further developing. Because it's always good to have a mix of internal and external pressures and forces that are pushing this character toward change. And then you also want to take the time to develop some of your secondary characters at this point. You don't have to put as much discovering their backstory and plotting that out. You may just have like a couple sentences about who this person was prior to the beginning of the story, and then how that character is going to influence the story, the character, or support the characters. Determine what their role is, and then give them a mini arc of their own. And this is mainly for secondary characters. If you have, tertiary characters who are just going to pop up once or twice, they don't really need their own arc. Mainly just with your secondary characters, if they are going to play a role that's going to be, more than a couple of interactions or having an influence on the main character, take the time to figure out who that character is and why they have influence or power to make change in this character's life. And step 4 is where you're going to really start constructing the plot. So build a timeline. Figure out where these events are going to happen in the story and how your character is going to move between those major events and plot points. Typically, a lot of writers like to use the 3-act structure. So Act 1 usually contains the meet cute and then the refusal and rejection. So kind of getting the story off the ground, introducing those characters. Act 2 has some sense of giving in. They kind of start the journey. They make some choices that are going to move them into a new path. Testing of relationships, the midpoint crisis, reconciliation. If it's a romance or has a romantic element, this is usually the falling in love section. And Act 2 will end with the breaking up or the crisis in the relationship. Act 3 is where you're going to see the sacrifice. So this is where major choices and changes have to be made. Characters put everything that they've been throughout the story into a moment where they have to decide where the rest of their path is going to go and how the story is going to end. So this is typically in romances. This is where your happily ever after or happy for now will occur. So once you have kind of those major pinch points in each of your acts, then you want to break that timeline into chapters. Where are these events happening throughout the story? And each chapter should have something important that helps move the story forward. If a chapter's not doing anything, then it needs to be reworked. It needs to, you need to dig deeper into it, or that scene just may need to be cut. And look again at your flow between the chapters. If everything is crammed together in one section, spread that out. Give the reader some time to breathe, some time to reflect on what's happening in the story. It can be exhausting for the reader if it's just go, go, go through the whole thing, and then long periods of not a whole lot happening. So really look at the balance as you're breaking these pinch points and developing the chapter progression. And step 5 is where you're going to really dig into developing individual scenes within those chapter by chapter outline sections. So here you're going to organize your major events into the appropriate chapters. List one major event or scene for every chapter. Like I said, there needs to be a purpose for that chapter existing in the story. So make sure something's happening, some information's being revealed, the character has a realization or a breakthrough. Something needs to happen in every chapter. And each chapter should also have its own theme and possibly major or minor plot points, depending on, the length and the depth of the story. You do want to add limited details about what will happen in each scene. You don't need to spend a huge amount of time on this, but if there are some important scene elements, settings, backstory things that need to come up, put that into the outline there so you're making sure that they're not being neglected or forgotten once you actually get to the writing portion. Something, again, needs to happen in each chapter, but you want to vary what that something is. So maybe action in one scene, dealing with some internal issues in another scene, discovering some information. Give the reader some variety and make sure that you're keeping them interested by having different things happen in subsequent chapters. And then each plot point that is included should move the story forward and should be relevant to the story. If, characters are just talking or wandering around a scene and you're not feeling like this is helping the story move forward, either, reevaluate and figure out what plot point does need to be incorporated, or possibly just cut that scene if it's not providing any real help to the story. And then there needs to be a constant progression in the storyline and in the characters. So as you're building this chapter by chapter outline, really look at, is something happening, but also is there progression in the story or in the character development from scene to scene? If there's a gap or a lull and you can't really identify what that scene's purpose is and how it's moving the story forward, then again, take a step back, reevaluate it, work it a little deeper, or get rid of it. And then you can at this time too add as much detail as you feel like is necessary to guide your writing. I wouldn't, spend a whole lot of time developing these details at this point, but you do want to put in the important ones that are going to help you remember what kind of scene you're trying to create. So give yourself some little reminders and hints on some of those smaller details, but still stay focused on the big picture element of the scene first. Make sure that the scene matters and is relevant, and then fill in some of those smaller details later with character traits or backstory or interesting information, that sort of thing. And the last aspect of outlining that I wanted to talk about is learning from the outline and from the outlining process. This part of outlining is really important, and I think it potentially can get skipped over too easily of okay, I have it all planned, now let's jump into the writing. But stopping to reflect on what you just put together is a really important part of the outlining process, and it can really make a big difference when you do start writing or when you go back to writing if you've kind of stopped mid-project and started an outline or built an outline for the rest of the story because you got stuck or something. Taking the time to really look through and evaluate the outline that you just put together can save you a lot of time when it comes to writing. So you really want to look back through the outline as a whole and take note of any inconsistencies, any missing information, or especially any dangling plot lines that maybe got started earlier in the outline and then just never really got wrapped up or didn't go anywhere. Keep an eye out for those and either go back and make sure that they're resolved, or if they just didn't work in the way that you thought they were going to, take them out. Just make sure that you're not leaving anything unfinished in that outline, because it can be all too easy to then, work those bits of information in as you're writing and then forget about them in that writing process as well. This is a really great opportunity to evaluate and improve the overall structure, your characters and the character arcs, the overall flow of the story, and the pacing of the story. You really want to remember to take a look at that flow and pacing in the outline process, because if you can identify those slow or weak areas in the outline, you're going to do a much better job of keeping that pacing up when you're doing the writing and actually completing the project. And then lastly, there's a few questions that you can ask to help identify any of these weak areas in your outline. So consider questions like, do any scenes present an idea that is left hanging? And this can be in any type of story, but especially in anything that involves some suspense or some mystery. You may bring something up as a hint and then just never get back to it, or something changed later in the story that then you didn't need that information. So make sure to identify any of those hanging subplots or bits of information or clues that just never really came to fruition. And then also ask, do any scenes need a bridge to improve the flow? If you're going back through your outline, especially the chapter by chapter section, and you feel like there's just a huge jump in the storyline or in the character arc where they make a sudden change that just doesn't quite have enough backing to it yet, find those areas, make notes, and make sure that either you address that in the outline or that you leave yourself a note to further develop that when you're writing that scene. And then, are there any scenes that are redundant or irrelevant? Are you repeating information multiple times to explain the same thing to more than one character? That's a common thing that happens. There are ways to summarize and kind of skim over that, so keep an eye out for those types of things, or characters kind of going on and on with the same internal dialogue over a problem, or rehashing something that doesn't need to be in multiple scenes. Keep an eye out for those and then address them, either trim, rework, or just get rid of some of those scenes. And then, are there any plot holes? This is a great time to identify plot holes before you put hours and hours into writing a story that is going to have a major flaw in it at some point. Really look through, make sure that your storyline as a whole makes sense and is cohesive. And then, are there any hints or questions that you brought up or added to the story early on that then were not answered or addressed later on in the story? And then, are there any character arcs that are left unfulfilled? And of course, you're majorly going to focus on your main characters and making sure that they go through the progression that they need to get to the ending that you've constructed. But also consider some of your side characters and secondary characters as well. Because like I mentioned before, they should have an arc. It's going to be a smaller, less developed arc, but they still need to have some kind of arc, and it needs to be completed by the end of the story. So take a second look at all of your characters, but especially the secondary characters, because those ones can be easy to kind of forget to wrap up at the end. And then also ask, does the ending provide a satisfying conclusion? And this doesn't necessarily mean that the reader is going to get the ending they wanted or hoped for. They don't have to love the ending. They might be surprised by the ending. And that's okay, but it does need to be satisfying and leave the reader feeling like, yes, that made sense. I can see how we got to this ending. Everything is wrapped up in a way that they feel comfortable with and feel satisfied with. And then lastly, are there any lagging sections where there is little to no progress? And this can be a little bit harder to identify in the outline because you're not writing the full scenes there. You may have something important that you want to get into that scene, and that's what you've put in your outline. And then when you go to write it, it's just not enough to fill up a whole scene. So, like I said, sometimes you can't always identify these lags just in the outline, but it's still good to look back through it and just make sure that at the outline stage, you're not finding those slow-moving sections, because they will definitely be even slower when you're writing out the scene. And then, just as the story takes multiple drafts before reaching completion, your outline can too. Sketching out some scenes or a chapter outline is not always, the final end-all be-all. You may need to rework this several times. You may have idea changes, or even as you're writing, if something changes, go back to your outline and rework that outline to reflect those changes so you know where those changes are going to lead, and so you don't get stuck later in the middle of the writing process. And then really just remember that outlines should act as a guide, not as a box. You may have come up with a really strong, well thought out outline, and then when you start writing, your character does something unexpected, or the story turns in a way that you hadn't planned for. That is perfectly fine. Explore those changes, those diversions, those new areas of possibility, and just be accepting that your outline may not be what you end up writing, but it still helped you work through the characters and the storyline ideas, and that is still really valuable. And it's still a great tool for developing the big picture aspects of the story, but that process should leave room for flexibility while you're writing, because when you're writing is when you're really going to dive into the characters and the stories, and you're really going to figure out who these characters are, what the world is like that they're living in, and what their journey is going to be. So don't be afraid to veer away from your outline, even if you put a lot of time and effort into it. If something different and better and more exciting comes to you when you're writing, go with it. You can always change your outline later. That's not something that should hold you back. So put in the work to create a plan, to really think out your characters and your plot, and then start writing and see where it goes. The end goal of writing this outline is to create a great story, not just to make a perfect outline. So explore, be creative, do what you do as a writer, and open yourself up to the possibilities of this story. But planning and thinking it out ahead of time can really save you some time and help you get started and jump into that project faster and work through it at a good pace that will help you be productive. So thank you for listening to the episode this week. We'll be back with new topics next week. More interviews with authors will be coming up. And again, our roundtables with some of my fellow best-selling reads authors. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all back here next time. Thanks again for listening to Author Life Podcast. For more information on the podcast or guest authors, check out the links in the show description. If there's a topic you'd like to learn more about, find me online and send me suggestions anytime.